Hi, everybody. Yesterday, Melissa and I visited the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, and I wanted to make a video to sort of share the experience with you, but I really needed a day to kind of think about what it was that I saw there because there's so many different levels and complexities of what the museum represents and tries to show that I really wanted to take some time to think about it. Now, the caveat I'm going to say at the very beginning is we only had 2 hours there, and clearly you could have way more than 2 hours to explore really two stories. And the first story is one of the building itself. It's a spectacularly designed building. It was very purposeful in its design. When you go in on the first level, and there are 7 different levels to it, you go in on the first level, and basically you're underground. And there's a timeline that talks about, from thousands of years ago, some of the more significant events in the evolution of human rights. And they list both positive and negative events in this timeline. And as you go up the building, which is almost like a mountain, conical shape to it, you have an intricate maze of ramps and lighted areas for you to travel, and each floor tells a different story. But the overall impression is, as you go from the darkness, that there's increasing light. There's more glass in the outer part of the building the higher up you go, and so that you feel that there's almost more of a hopeful thing as we go through time from thousands of years ago to present day. I think that was what the purpose of the architect, what was in the architect's mind in designing the building. It's a beautiful structure. It really stands out on the skyline, and that in itself is very worthy. The second story is of the exhibits themselves, and I can't imagine a more ambitious project to try to put together than a museum of human rights. Not only because of the enormity of that topic, but there's also incredibly hard decisions that you have to make about what to include and what not to include. Because when and to give you an example what I mean, and again, we only had 2 hours there, so if I'm saying anything that may have been missing or points out a contradiction or an issue, it could be just the result of us not having enough time there. But on the timeline, whenever you put a timeline together, you talk about one specific event. And the problem with the one specific event is it almost takes it out of context. To give you an example, they talk about in 1995 the Serbian War. And the decisions that they make to talk about are highlighting the brutality that the Serbian government did. And there's no question that there are atrocities made. But what it takes out, or at least it doesn't mention, and I know this as a fact because of a very close friend of mine who was graduating high school at the time that NATO started bombing, that even during that time, NATO, who from our eyes was going there to right the wrongs that were being done, my friend came back one weekend from being away just in time to hear a thunderous roar as NATO planes swooped over the town market and dropped canister bombs that he sadly had to watch rip apart the bodies of women, men, elderly, and children. So that kind of stuff isn't talked about or was missed there, but they said one side of it. And again, this is not I may have missed it where they said it, but it's just one of the difficulties, I think, of when you try to put things into a timeline. Now, as you go up the building, they explore racism, genocide, authoritarianism. They look at women's issues, issues for people who are physically disabled, LGBTQ plus issues, religious freedom and religious persecution, and issues for our indigenous communities around the world. One floor talks specifically about Canadian issues and the evolution of how we look at human rights in Canada. One of the things that was incredibly impressive is they talk about big picture, sort of political and economic context around human rights, but there are plenty of examples of personal stories where they have actual first person depiction of what people have gone through, both in times past and modern times, because many of the museum doesn't pretend that we have solved all of the issues around human rights. One of the things that I thought was very poignant and very succinct is when, and I believe it was Roosevelt that started this, we're talking about the 4 basic human rights. 2 of them are freedoms of, and 2 of them are freedoms from. That I believe was part of the bones behind the UN Charter of Human Rights. And talked about the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, and the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. There was one huge display that was dedicated to genocide and the Holocaust, and the racism that involved a group such as the KKK. And I promised myself not to get too political currently in this sort of sharing of what the museum had to offer, but it would be remiss to not point out that when you look at the origins of this, these movements towards authoritarianism and the genocides that happened, it's hard not to see how things repeat themselves throughout history, and that we must ever remain vigilant and concerned and aware, and keep our eyes, ears, and thoughts and minds open to analyzing what's going on around us, to try to do the best we can to prevent those sorts of things from happening again, and so that the promise of this building, this architectural structure that moves up toward the light, toward brightness, towards hope, will become realized. Thanks for watching. Take care, everybody. Can't wait to see you all when we get back home.